And welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Angeline Ong. Our focus today is on investing in gene editing, and our guest is Amy Kong, Chief Investment Officer at Barrett Asset Management. COVID-19 and the subsequent success of mRNA vaccines have transformed what was a promising technology into a gold rush as investors scrambled for companies with a foothold in the field of genomics, which also includes gene therapy. But like the science behind it, investing in this space is complex. There are a number of indices and funds that track this sector. Here are four. Many of these did exceptionally well during the so-called tech melt-up last year. But since then, they've languished as interest waned in high-growth, high-priced thematic funds. The most tracked of these is, of course, Cathie Wood's ARC Genomic Revolution, or ARC-G. But even for a seasoned investor, many of these companies are not household names. This fund includes biotech firms such as Regeneron, as well as companies such as Teladoc Health, which is a provider of virtual healthcare services. So why and how should investors approach the sector? Let's ask Amy Kong of Barrett Asset Management. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. It's such an interesting space, and it's not an easy sector to get your head around. Talk us through the framework and explain why this is an interesting opportunity.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, it is a very fascinating area. I think, quite frankly, the pandemic has certainly brightened the spotlight on the area of gene therapy and why this could be a viable science going forward. It probably all started more with the messenger RNA or mRNA technology that we all know today exists in some of the COVID vaccines that are being administered around the world. Now, just to be clear, mRNA is not necessarily gene therapy, but it is linked. In the sense of mRNA, you are sending a set of codes into your body to prompt your brain and your body to react in a series of ways. And in the case of the COVID vaccine, as an example, what it's saying to the body is to create the spike protein, the pathogen that you would commonly find in the coronavirus. And so when the body thinks you have it, it creates that immune system against it. Now, the idea of being able to send that set of code into your body to trigger a series of events, that I think is the premise of why gene therapy is getting more exciting and certainly getting that momentum and the attention that we have seen more lately. With gene therapy, there is a little bit of a difference. You are actually altering the genes inside your body, the DNA sequence that you and I are born with. Just to give you some tidbits, the World Health Organization actually estimates that there are about 10,000 single gene diseases out there today. Think cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, Huntington's disease, the list goes on. And the idea is if scientists can, again, use these techniques in some combination, I think could be very powerful to tackle these diseases that we don't have cures for today. And so in terms of the science, it's fascinating, but also thinking about it from an investment framework, I think it's a really good, again, pairing, and it really creates a compelling argument of why this particular area and why this trend is worth monitoring going forward.
So that's the science. How would you invest? Would you pick out the companies with a promising pipeline or more so proven treatments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, there are a couple of ways to go about at it. Certainly finding the direct pure plays is one way. It's easy enough to do, but there are some risks to that. So a lot of these companies are still in its infancy, not quite profitable yet. And a lot of these companies are also still fundraising, which is another risk, as the fundraising can potentially dilute equity share base. And so that is certainly, a risk that I think investors should be aware of. There are ETFs, to your point, that have become very creative in trying to gain access to these particular areas. I have not yet seen a pure play on genomics ETF just yet, but a lot of these ETFs do pair genome-related stocks with other broader areas within healthcare, like biotech. And one may argue that actually dilutes the exposure to the area, but I actually would differ in that sense. And in the sense that a lot of these biotech companies, you mentioned Regeneron, but Vertex is another example. These are large, profitable biotech companies. They actually have partnerships with a lot of these smaller pure plays. And so With ETFs that pair the two groups together, you actually get direct and indirect exposure to some of these, some of these smaller, not yet profitable, but very promising companies. So I actually find that to be a compelling pairing, and would advise investors perhaps to look in that route as opposed to maybe finding the specific companies. As in any ETF, I would also advise investors to think through the composition of the ETFs, the quality of the performance, history track record. Some of these are newer. And then, of course, fee ratios are very important as well. I've seen expense ratios range from 40 basis points to as high as 100 basis points. And so you certainly want to be mindful of those metrics as well.
So that pairing play is very interesting, Amy. How about for those investors who are not so experienced in this sector, would you say they should perhaps look at a general healthcare index?
Yeah, I actually think the general healthcare index will also get you some exposure, certainly not as much. General healthcare indices are fantastic because they give you the diversification that you need. You are getting, again, exposure to a number of different areas within the healthcare spectrum. But if you are looking to play this one trend specifically, your exposure within a general healthcare ETF is certainly going to be lower. However, as we all know it, the general healthcare ETFs are also cheaper. And so again, you just have to weigh what is most important to you, but you certainly will get exposure one way or another. Perhaps the amount of exposure will differ depending on which ETF you pick.
Now, Amy, with every opportunity, there are risks as well. There are a couple of traps here. One is, of course, that thematic funds have underperformed this year. Is investing in trends, is this sound investment practice in the longer term?
I think it depends on the trend. Certainly, there are trends that are more trade oriented and could lose momentum just as quickly as it's gained momentum. I think in the case of genetics and gene therapy, as we're talking about, in my opinion, it is more of a longer term theme that is worth monitoring. And so ultimately, when one investor thinks through whether to invest in a thematic ETF, you certainly want to pay attention to what the top holdings are, because that usually is what determines performance of the entire fund, just because of the concentration towards some of the larger holdings. Ultimately, as a fundamental investor, we pay attention to cash flow, we pay attention to the fundamentals. We do want to make sure that there is a pairing against companies that are actually making money. And so we certainly would think of a thematic ETF as a way to complement perhaps a general healthcare ETF. I wouldn't use just thematic ETFs as the way to go. I think they would act well from a complementary standpoint.
Right, Amy, we have to leave it there. Very interesting, fast-paced sector there. I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point. That was Amy Kong, CIO of Barrett Asset Management. Before I go, here are some of the top stories in the sector. Indonesia has approved the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use for everyone aged 12 years and over in the Southeast Asian nation. The government said Thursday the country is now facing a worst-case scenario epidemic with only 5.8% of its 270 million people vaccinated. Hospitals on Java Island have been swarmed, with many people struggling to get treatment as daily infections rose above the current tally in India. Chinese regulators have completed their review of the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Germany's BioNTech and China's Fosun Pharma. And the vaccine is now in the administrative review stage. China has yet to approve any vaccine developed overseas, but has green-lighted several domestic brands. Chinese media are now reporting the BioNTech vaccine could begin trial production in August. And the World Health Organization has called for gene editing technologies to treat serious diseases, and that it should be shared more generously to allow poorer nations to benefit from developments in the field. Intellectual property in medicine became a contested issue when US President Joe Biden proposed a temporary waiver of vaccine patents for COVID-19 vaccines. Pharmaceutical companies in other countries have argued against the sharing of patents, saying it would discourage investment in new technologies. And that's your roundup of the genomics sector. I'm Angeline Ong, and this is Reuters.